At 100 years old, The Great Gatsby is among the top literary pieces to perfectly capture a moment and place in time. It simultaneously portrays the Jazz Age in all its frenetic glory and contains a powerful critique of the American dream. Its exploration of wealth, social class, and the disillusionment of pursuing material success still resonates today. Gatsby was F. Scott Fitzgerald's third novel and commercial success. Published in 1925, it was preceded by This Side of Paradise in 1920 and The Beautiful and Damned in 1922. His final complete novel, Tender is the Night, was published in 1934. Between novels, he was a prolific short story writer, publishing often in popular magazines. Fitzgerald was born in 1896 in St. Paul, Minnesota, to a Catholic middle-class family. He began publishing stories in his school and college papers, determined to be a professional writer. While on Christmas break from Princeton University, Fitzgerald began a romantic relationship with Chicago debutante Ginevra King, who became his literary model for several of his characters, including Gatsby's Daisy Buchanan. King would ultimately reject Fitzgerald's courtship due to his financial and class status. Despondent and suicidal over King's rejection, Fitzgerald enlisted in the U.S. Army amid World War I, receiving a commission as a second lieutenant. While awaiting deployment, he was stationed at training camp Fort Leavenworth under Dwight Eisenhower. Hoping to publish before his perceived imminent death in Europe, Fitzgerald wrote a 120,000-word manuscript, which was rejected by Scribner's Publishing. In June 1918, he was garrisoned at Camp Sheridan near Montgomery, Alabama. In November 1918, Fitzgerald was transferred to Camp Mills, Long Island. While there, the Allied powers signed an armistice with Germany, ending the war in the European theater. Fitzgerald was then dispatched back to Montgomery to await discharge, which quickly happened in February 1919. While stationed in Montgomery the first time, Fitzgerald met affluent debutante and Southern belle Zelda Sayre. She was one of the most celebrated young women of Montgomery's country club set. Even though Fitzgerald was still writing desperate letters to King, he started a romance with Zelda. Their courtship was interrupted by Fitzgerald's transfer to Long Island, but resumed upon his return. Zelda was born in Montgomery, Alabama in 1900 to wealthy Episcopalian parents. Her father was an Alabama state legislator in the post-Reconstruction era and authored the 1893 Act, which disenfranchised Black Alabamians for 70 years and ushered in the Jim Crow period in the state. A privileged youth, Zelda took ballet lessons and enjoyed the outdoors, as well as drank gin, smoked cigarettes, and was described as a flirt. Her actions were often the subject of Montgomery gossip, though her reputation was often saved by her father's intervention. Fitzgerald called Zelda daily, visiting on his free days from military service. He earnestly told her of his dreams of writing, which Zelda dismissed as boastfulness. Completely infatuated, Fitzgerald even rewrote a character in his rejected Scribner's manuscript to more closely resemble Zelda. Fitzgerald would later describe the early months of their courtship as reckless. They met in July 1918 and had consummated their relationship by December. Although Fitzgerald had not actually intended to marry her, they considered themselves as informally engaged, even as Zelda declined to marry him until he proved financially successful. Fitzgerald moved to New York to try to make his writing career viable, but he was rejected over 120 times and sold only one story for $30. In June of 1919, with his financial outlook dim, Zelda ended their engagement. Dispirited from the broken engagement and loath of his low-paying job in advertising, Fitzgerald was again, and very publicly, suicidal. He moved back to St. Paul in July 1919 and dedicated himself to reworking the rejected Scribner's script. This would, in September of that year, be published as This Side of Paradise, his first commercially successful novel. The novel debuted March 26, 1920, and he and Zelda, who had reconciled, married days later on April 3rd in New York. The first months of their marriage in New York were marked with partying, wild behavior, and hotel evictions. Alcohol fueled their nightly escapades, like climbing into the Plaza Hotel's fountain fully clothed. Privately, their affection for each other cooled, and they fought bitterly. New York newspapers used Zelda and Fitzgerald as cautionary examples of youth and excess, to their apparent delight. They eventually moved to Westport, Connecticut, where Fitzgerald worked on his second novel, and Zelda struggled with household responsibilities after leaning on African American servants in her formative years. Her dependence on servants hired by Fitzgerald became easy fodder for magazines. While Fitzgerald wrote his second novel, Zelda became homesick for the Deep South. She told him that she'd missed Southern cuisine, like peaches and biscuits for breakfast. So they traveled back to Montgomery, staying with her parents for several weeks before returning to Connecticut. Zelda's parents visited them soon after, but ardently disapproved of their hedonistic lifestyle. In February 1921, Zelda discovered she was pregnant. She asked Fitzgerald for their child to be born on Southern soil in Alabama, but he refused. Of the situation, she wrote, "Scott's changed. He used to say he loved the South, but now he wants to get as far away from it as he can." Fitzgerald insisted that the baby be born in his hometown of St. Paul. In October 1921, baby Frances Scotty Fitzgerald was born. She would be their only child. After the publication of his second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, the Fitzgeralds moved to France. They lived there for nearly 6 years among other artists and writers who flocked to Paris to experience the epicenter of culture. The Parisian artist's lifestyle embraced extravagance, diversity, and creativity. The city became a hotspot of expression and an instrument of artistic direction characterized by the disillusionment and pessimism of the end of the Great War. It was in France that Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby. Over the 1920s, the Fitzgeralds' marriage deteriorated due to affairs, alcoholism, obsessive behaviors, and Zelda's physical and mental illness. Zelda was especially prone to breakdowns brought on by loneliness and boredom while Scott was writing, and she eventually had multiple stays in mental health hospitals. In 1930, she was diagnosed as schizophrenic, although modern physicians speculate she had bipolar disorder. Fitzgerald hired full-time nurses and attendants to care for her at all times. In 1931, they visited Montgomery to attend Zelda's father on his deathbed. His death triggered another breakdown. During one of her hospital stays in 1932, Zelda drafted a manuscript called Save Me the Waltz, and it was published in October of that year. The story had strong parallels to the Fitzgeralds. The protagonist, Alabama Beggs, is the daughter of a Southern judge who marries a painter who becomes famous. They are expatriates to France, where Alabama becomes obsessed with ballet, as Zelda did. Alabama becomes ill from exhaustion, and the novel ends with them returning to the American South as her father is dying. Echoing Zelda's experiences, the novel portrays Alabama's struggle to establish herself independently of her husband and earn respect for her own accomplishments. Reviews of the book were overwhelmingly negative. After increasingly bad episodes, Fitzgerald placed Zelda in Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina in 1936. During her confinement, Fitzgerald moved to California for a $1,000 a week job with MGM. While in relationships with other women, he repeatedly attempted sobriety, suffered from depression, had violent outbursts, and attempted suicide. He had immense guilt over Zelda's hospitalization and frequently flew to the East Coast to visit her. Zelda and Fitzgerald saw each other for the last time in April 1939. Scott returned to Hollywood to pay off debts accrued from Zelda's hospitalizations. In March 1940, Zelda was discharged to her mother's care. The Fitzgeralds planned to visit later in the year. Unfortunately, Scott died of a heart attack before they could see each other. After his death, Zelda discovered and published his unfinished manuscript, The Love of the Last Tycoon. Over the 1940s, Zelda resided in and out of sanatoriums, alternating with living with her mother in Alabama. By 1946, she had undergone 10 years of electroshock therapy and insulin shock treatments, resulting in severe memory loss and an apathetic personality. Zelda returned to Highland Hospital in Asheville in November 1947, where she remained until her death. On March 10, 1948, she was one of 9 women who perished when the hospital caught fire. The Great Gatsby lives on as F. Scott Fitzgerald's most beloved and popular work. It has had 6 major film adaptations and numerous stage and television adaptations. Widely considered a literary masterpiece, Gatsby continues to attract popular and scholarly attention today.